Yeah, Graham, happy to. Good to be back with you, everybody. Hope you've had a good team time. And it was about 5 years ago when we were looking for someone who could really expand Fuller's training efforts. We wanted someone who had already done this in a local church, but someone who had really embodied this work. So about 5 years ago, we had hired Matthew to join us and really start these sorts of trainings and to figure out how we could help more churches be more effective. And Matthew spent a few years with our team and really pioneered and got some amazing things going. He was part of helping one church join the training about 4 years ago and go through this growing young cohort. And you got to be careful when you have your teammates meet other great churches and people, because every once in a while they ask those people to come work for them. So it was a couple of years ago, Matthew transitioned from our team over to work for this church that's been going through the growing young cohort, and he's on the leadership team. But we've stayed in touch with Matthew. And so when we were planning this and Graham brought up the idea, we thought, absolutely, we can't think of anybody better for you to hear from about what it looks like to continue the growing young journey than Matthew. So Matthew, with that, I'll pass it over to you from Colorado.
Hello, can you hear me?
You're good.
Perfect. Hey, everybody. So glad that I get to join you guys. I loved my time working specifically with the Fuller Youth Institute full time, and that being my main focus. And then I've loved just staying in contact with the team there. So I've got about a half hour that I'm gonna share a little bit. I want to share a little bit of context on our church. I want to share some thoughts about growing young that I think have helped us maybe 4 years in. And then I want to end by sharing some stories. Anyway, I think there's some questions about slides. I actually don't have slides. I'm just going to run with this. And so no worries on the slides. But a little bit about my church. Our church, before the church joined the Growing Young cohort, was called Greeley Wesleyan Church. And when the church joined the cohort, and about that year, transitioned their name to become Generations Church. When it was Greeley Wesleyan Church, it was known as maybe one of the larger churches in our denomination, but had become increasingly, I don't know if stuffy is the right word, but had become increasingly stuffy and kind of felt like if you weren't really maybe a member at the church, then you really couldn't be a part of the church. I don't know if in Scotland you have this phrase, it's a golf reference, right? But we would say that this would be a country club church here in the United States. I don't know if that's a phrase there, but it's basically like you're either a member, you're in, or you're out. And the church had steadily declined, and we weren't on the verge of closing or anything like that, but we had become increasingly older and increasingly smaller. And a new lead pastor came in about 5 years ago and made some significant changes, got connected with the growing young cohort through a good friend who's here on staff, a good friend of mine who's here on staff. And that's kind of that's a little bit of the history of the church. Since then, our church has exploded in the numbers of young adults. And I would just say overall vibrancy, like we talk about in Growing Young. And it's been just a real privilege to be a part of that. We're growing in older adults, and we're simultaneously growing in young adults as well. And so that's been really exciting. So that's a little bit about the context there. Let me share some thoughts about growing young that I think might be helpful before I share some stories. The first one is this. A lot of people, especially when I was leading the growing young cohorts, used to ask, hey, do we need to use the term growing young? Like, how much do we need to use the language of growing young? The words growing young almost never get mentioned here. Almost never. Sorry, Jake. They almost never get talked about. But the principles of growing young are the driving force of almost everything that we do. And it's actually kind of funny because I work directly with our lead pastor here at the church, and he never talks about growing young, but like specifically, but the things that he cares about and the things that he's passionate about are all things I would literally argue that came from the growing young cohort. And so if you're wondering, oh man, our leadership doesn't talk about growing young enough, I would say that the growing young language doesn't matter as much as the principles of growing young. So we are embodying growing young, but almost never actually use the language. So I don't know if that's helpful. another thought is, I'm going to empathize with you here as leaders. I was a pastor, as Jake mentioned, for a long time, went to work at Fuller and then went back into the church. And in just those few years of working at Fuller, I realized I forgot how long it takes to make long-term change. And how hard it is to make long-term change, and that people disagree so much on how to make long-term change, including my lead pastor and I. We look at things very differently. My joke is that he is very much ready, fire, aim when he makes decisions, and I'm very much ready, aim, fire. I'm very almost like a sniper, really strategic in my change that I make. He is very quick in his change. And both I think are needed. And we've had to figure out how to work together, and how different leaders who think different ways make change the best. And so both are valuable, but people disagree on how change actually happens. And I think I forgot that. Anyway, that's another thought. Another one would be, I used to say this all the time in the cohort, and it's so true here, that programs seldom change people, but people often change people. And I want to reiterate and encourage the fact that growing young is not a program to be implemented. It has to be people oriented. There has to be a name and a face attached to what you're doing. It has to be centered on people. And so, our mission as a church lends itself to that, because we would say that we want one more person to find Jesus and one more person to follow Jesus. It's not based on programs, it's based on relationships. And I would say that is a lot of the way that you'll make change happen at Growing Young, is if you don't view it programmatically, but if you view it relationally. I know you are just finishing up your big, hairy, audacious goals, your BHAGs. And by the way, I just thought I'd make a comment here that when I hear BHAG and I think of Scotland, I think it makes perfect sense to call them BHAGGis. I think that is really funny in my mind. Maybe you don't think that's funny, but I think I would just call them BHAGGises maybe. But anyway, your BHAGs are critically important. They are a massive priority. But here's the thing. It's okay if they take time to be implemented. I don't know if this quote has been shared yet in the cohort. I know you're a couple of years in. One of the things that is incredibly important for us was the concept of that we tend to overestimate what we can do in 1 year and underestimate what can be done in 3 years, or in our case, 4 to 5 years. I mean, we're 4 to 5 years into this process as a church. And I think that we maybe overestimated what could be done in the first year and underestimated what could be done in these last 3, 4, 5 years. And so that's been really important to us. A couple more thoughts would be that I think I've realized here that your church can simultaneously focus on older people and still prioritize young adults. That this isn't just a way to get rid of the work that we do with young adults older adults, and not prioritize older adults. In fact, I actually think that the prioritizing of older adults matters. And we've heard people say things like, well, we just don't matter anymore. Only young people matter. And I would say, no, that's not true. We actually need older adults in the church more than ever before. It's just that we need older adults in the church to pour into the lives of younger people with their experience, their wisdom, their guidance. And so older adults matter more than ever before, and you can still prioritize young adults when you also focus on older adults. And then maybe the last one would be this, is that the biggest changes that we're seeing in our church are bigger than ever 4 to 5 years in. I think that if we would have stopped the change process where you're at in the process 2 years in, we wouldn't be near the progress that we are now. And that probably goes without saying, right? It's, well, you're over 2 times as long into the process as we are. It's easy to give up 2 years in where you're at, because it's tiring and you may not see the progress that you want to see, or to see the changes that you've wanted to see. Your hard work it doesn't reflect the changes that have actually been made, right? You're like, we've worked so hard, but we haven't seen things happen. I would say there's a tipping point there was a tipping point for us about 3 years in, that if we would have given up, we just would have never seen. And so those are some of maybe just the bigger picture thoughts about growing young that I was thinking through when I was leading cohorts, and then also have been thinking about here at our specific church. I just want to go through some stories here, because I think stories open up an imagination of, what you could be doing in your church context. And it may not be directly related because context matters. But I think that I think a lot of these things are implementable in other contexts as well. And I started thinking through the 6 core commitments, of growing young, and how we've worked through those changes. And so I'm just going to go through those 6 core commitments, with the exception of one. I'm going to go through them in order of the growing young wheel, with the exception of empathy, which I'll talk about in a second, and tell some stories along the way. So Keychain Leadership, probably the most important change that we made with Keychain Leadership the year we did the cohort was we implemented a residency program specifically for young adults. I would say that the changes that we made early on in the cohort, we had the most progress with children's ministry and youth ministry. And so our main focus has been on young adults more than anything, but we created a residency program where students who are working on their ministry degrees can come and work at our church for 1 year or 2 years. So we ask for a 1-year commitment at minimum, and you can stay for up to 2 years. And then our job is to help those young adults, those young post-college students, get placed into churches long-term. And so since we launched this, the number's not high, but the commitment has been significant. We've had 11 residents go through our residency program for at least a year, and many of them have gone through for 2 years. We started with 1 resident. Our commitment is it's $700 a month for the first year, a resident, $900 a month for a second-year resident, and we provide a host home for them. So it's more like a stipend than anything. We have married residents, we have single residents. We started with 1, and now we're at 5, and our goal in the next 3 years is to actually get to 10 residents. That's been a huge focus on actually handing keys of leadership over to young people and having them have weighty ministry responsibility here. A real quick example of that would be that our residents, this was probably the biggest thing that residents have ever done church-wide, but our residents led our Ash Wednesday service this year at the church. And here's what's fascinating, is that I just turned 40. I'm 40 years old. I'm very old at this point. No, I just turned 40. And what's interesting is that for me as a 40-year-old working with these young adults in their early 20s, they put together this Ash Wednesday service. And I remember thinking, I would not lead that way. Like I just wouldn't lead it that way. And I had to remember that even though often I think young, I'm still 40 years old. And there are valuable ways that people in their early 20s think. Here's what was so cool, is that the majority of us would have said, we wouldn't have led it that way. It was so incredibly well received, especially by the older people in our congregation. And all we did was just had to give up leadership responsibility that we wanted probably, but we gave it to our young adults, and it was huge. And so it was a really big deal. And I think that residents felt like they were carrying weighty ministry responsibility because of that Ash Wednesday service. I want to talk about empathy in a little bit, and it's because that's the one of the 6 that I would say we struggle with the most here at Generations. So I want to end on that one. But moving on, talking about taking Jesus's message seriously. I think about the statistic that is shared in the book that 40% of people specifically mentioned that they were challenged by the gospel. And that's why they were a part of the church. We have seen that be really significant here. We actually just finished up a 7-week series called Lukewarm, where we were challenging people to basically say, maybe partly because of COVID or new rhythms in your life because of COVID. We just said, we think there's a lot of Christians who are lukewarm, and we need to actually be serious about the gospel. And so we did this Lukewarm series, and what was so cool was that all generations at the church have cared about this. I heard a young adult talking to an 80-year-old at our church that said, this is the kick in the pants that we needed as a church to get us back on track. And I love that language because the 80-year-old looked at that young adult and totally agreed. So we have been really trying to take Jesus's message seriously. Since then, there's a woman who works in our student ministry who her name is Amy, and she wants to go into full-time ministry. There's a young adult named Luke who's 23 years old, and he was in the military. He got out of the military, and through this series, he wants to become a missionary, an overseas missionary. And then we have new leaders, especially young adults, who are committed to becoming small group leaders. The number of young adults who have gotten baptized because of the gospel being taken seriously has significantly increased. And then we had double the number of people during this series that we would ordinarily have in our small groups, because our small groups were connected to this sermon series. And the groups that grew the most were young adults. And I was at a young adult group late last night. There were 22 adults, there were 11 couples, and 30 children who were together in these couple rooms. It was fascinating watching them just as they took the gospel seriously. And so taking Jesus's message seriously is a big one. Warmth has been really big for us, especially because historically our church was known as more of a stuffy country club church. The year that we joined the cohort, we started saying the phrase, "You belong here," and trying to embody that and care about it. This weekend, so this is 5 years later, basically, this weekend at our church, the entire sermon is focused on belonging here. You belong here. And challenging the idea that it's not that we try to become like family, but we really become like a family here at our church. And so the entire sermon is going to be focused on warmth and belonging. Here's the interesting thing. Besides the word belong, you belong here, like the growing young words or language is not really going to get used. I know the sermon. I've seen the notes for the sermon that our lead pastor is going to preach. He's not specifically saying growing young, but everything he's doing or everything he's talking about is embodying growing young. And so warmth has been a big piece. We also, since we've tried to become more warm and family oriented as a church, have actually grown in diversity. We were in a fairly diverse area, and we have grown in diversity. And we were typically like just traditionally have just been a Caucasian church, a white church. And so we've been able to grow in diversity as a result, which has been really exciting as well. The last two, prioritizing young people and families. One of the first changes that was made, this is before I came here, while we were still in the cohort, was that, I don't know if you guys do in Scotland, like a vacation Bible school, or you focus on like a week of prioritizing like children, but our vacation Bible school that we do each year, we have about 700 children that are part of our vacation Bible school. And we have prioritized that all staff literally take the entire week and we just focus in on our families. And we have about 200 volunteers who are part of the Vacation Bible School Week now. That has been really cool. When we were in the Growing Young cohort, this was before I came here, we launched a young adult ministry called Sub 30. The idea is that you're under 30 years old, Sub 30, and that was focused on young adults. And that what's interesting is that the commitment for young adults, the numbers aren't as high today as they were when we previously launched, but the commitment from young adults is significantly higher. And so we've kind of navigated, is it about numbers? Is it about commitment? And we've landed on, we want young adults to be committed. We have the luxury of having a college, a fairly large college in our town, about 5 miles away. And so we've prioritized our young adult ministry to be as much focused on the University of Northern Colorado campus as much as possible. And that has been significant, is being on campus with them and prioritizing young people that way. The last one, the last core commitment, and then I want to share one final story, would be best neighbors. And I would say this is probably our biggest area of growth. And it's mostly because we were known as the stuffy church, and we were not involved in the community. We were not really involved. We weren't really good neighbors. We were just kind of focused on ourselves. And where we've seen the most progress is actually being involved in local public schools. So we had this idea that we wanted to do when we were in the cohort, we wanted to do homeless ministry and actually have homeless people come in and use part of our building to do a homeless ministry here at the church. And what we found out from the police department was that we weren't allowed to do that because our school is basically flanked by our church is flanked by 2 schools. We have a high school that literally we share a parking lot with that has 1,800 students. And we were not involved in that school, and we share a parking lot with them. And so we said, well, let's get involved in Greeley West High School. And so we wanted to get involved in some elementary schools. Well, what ended up happening was we got shut down on the homeless ministry. And 2 weeks later, an elementary school less than a mile away ended up having a large pipe that burst, and it flooded out, and they needed a place to meet. And so because we were trying to be focused on being best neighbors, we said, hey, you could use our building. And what that led to was Meeker Elementary School, this elementary school, actually using our building for the entire school year. And we found out at the end that the state was actually going to give us money. We didn't know this going in, was going to give us money for housing them. They gave us $150,000 that was unexpected after housing this school. And instead of pumping that money toward other things, we pumped it directly into our children's ministry so that we could focus on families. And so it was this gift, this blessing that came out of nowhere that we said we want to pump that directly back into family ministry. The other thing that was really neat was we got connected with this high school, with Greeley West High School. They are currently building a $140 million building that opens up in the fall. And when the builders met with the school and they were trying to figure out what the building was going to look like, the school said, we have such a good relationship with Generations Church that when we rebuild and restructure what the church is going to, or the school is going to look like, we want to keep the parking lot where it is so that we can have, so that the church can have overflow parking on large service weekends, so they can use our parking lot still on those weekends. Like, this is a public school that is helping us as a church because we invested in relationships there. We're providing meals for every single high school teacher in May that teaches at Greeley West High School. So it's simple things that can be done. We fed 300 construction workers working on this $140 million building. We fed 300 construction workers one day last summer, just trying to say, hey, we care about you. We're so glad that you use our parking lot. We use your parking lot. We want to bless you. And so those are some of the ways that we have seen areas of best neighbors grow. And it's completely, our church, the way our church is viewed has been completely changed because of the way that we have cared about neighbors. People see us as a welcoming, open church now. And that's been really, really cool. So the biggest struggle would be probably with empathy. I think that we're probably at a point where our current older adults would say, well, we know the church doesn't grow from older people, it grows from younger people. They've got the vision of it in their mind, but they still don't understand or maybe care about the differences of young adults. And so we still feel a little bit separated. I would say that we are not fully integrated as an intergenerational church yet, and we're trying really hard to make some of those changes. We've debated doing roundtable discussions with older adults and younger adults. We've debated bringing in an organization called the Colossian Forum that specializes in hard conversations, that might be related to hot button issues or hot button topics here in the US. And then we've debated doing panel discussions where we invite different generations together to have those panel discussions. This one, I would just say, is going to take time. But rather than waiting on that, we have pushed forward in other areas of low-hanging fruit, which is what I think your BHAGs or your BHAGuses should focus on, is the low-hanging fruit. What are the easy things that you can do in your ministry? And just knowing that the harder things are going to take more time. Empathy is just not one of the low-hanging fruits of our area, but we're confident that we're eventually going to get there, and we're just not going to give up. And so it might take 6 years, it might take 7 years to get there before we make progress with empathy. That said, I want to share one final story that on empathy working well. And this actually, I shared this in California when Graham was there, and Graham was like, you need to share this story. And so I'm going to share this story because I think it's a beautiful picture of empathy. When I grew up in a small rural community, and I had a paper route when I was in middle school. And in the middle of the paper route was this like assisted living facility called Four Seasons Village. And there were, I don't know, 10 or 15 people in Four Seasons Village that were on my paper route. So I would go and I'd wake up at 5 in the morning and I would drop off the newspaper at these people's houses and I would come back home. One day I finished up the paper route and I got home and there was a message on our answering machine at home. Do you remember answering machines? There was like a little blinking light and it had a message and I clicked play and it was this woman named Norma. And Norma was in Four Seasons Village and she said, "Hi, my name is Norma. Matthew, you forgot my newspaper." But the problem is this, I had not forgotten Norma's newspaper, okay? Like I had not forgotten her newspaper, but I think she thought I forgot her newspaper. And so I called back as a very smug middle schooler and said, "Hi, Norma, this is Matthew. I don't know what you're talking about. I dropped off your newspaper." And she said, "Well, no, you didn't." And the problem is that if you forgot a newspaper, I needed to get my parents to drive me to a store. I needed to use my own money to buy a newspaper and bring that newspaper to the person who didn't get their newspaper. And so I was like, fine. I finally relented and said, fine, I'll do it. So I went with my parents, got the newspaper, and I was walking up to Norma's house to bring her newspaper, and she greeted me at the door, and she was very kind. She said, "Hi, Matthew." And I remember taking the newspaper as a middle schooler, and I wasn't a Christian then, but I threw the newspaper on the ground, and I walked off and didn't say a word. And as I was walking off, Norma said, "Thanks, Matthew." And I went away. I didn't say a word. The next morning, it's 5 in the morning, and I'm walking through Four Seasons Village, and I get to Norma's house, and guess who greets me at the door? It's Norma. I in my head, I was like, this is her. I renamed her Micromanaging Norma. You know, like, what in the world are you doing? Meeting me here at 5 in the morning. You know, like I may have forgotten your newspaper yesterday, but it was one time. Why are you greeting me? "Hi, Matthew," she said. I took the newspaper and I put it in her mailbox and I walked off and didn't say a word. 2 weeks go by. Every single day at 5 in the morning, Norma's there greeting me at the door, constantly like, "Hi, Matthew. Hi, Matthew." 2 weeks in, now she has her husband, George, there. She's roped in her husband. I'm like, oh my goodness. And so months go by and Norma and George, they meet me at the door every day at 5 a.m. to say hi. At some point, they invited me into the house. They baked me cookies. It was like a really I actually came to appreciate George and Norma. And I was still a middle schooler or whatever, but they were really kind. Well, eventually I quit my paper route and I flash forward till I'm 18 years old and I just graduated from high school and I ended up going to a summer camp and became a Christian at this Christian summer camp. And I got connected to this church right afterwards and I walked in the church for the very first time. And as I walked into the lobby of the church, guess who I see for the first time in years? I see Norma. She's across the lobby of the church. She, as fast as she could, kind of hobbles over to me and she says, "Matthew, I heard that you became a Christian last week at summer camp." And I said, "Yeah, I did." And Norma just starts weeping. And I was like, this is getting a little awkward, right? And she said, "Matthew, do you remember the day that you forgot my newspaper?" And I was like, no, I didn't forget. No, I didn't say that. I did not say that. But I was like, yeah, I remember that. And she said, "I felt like God just told me in my heart, like in my spirit, you need to wake up at 5 in the morning every day and you need to pray for Matthew and greet him at the door and pray that Matthew would one day become a Christian, that he would one day trust in me." This is what she felt like God was telling her. And so she said, "Matthew, I've been up every day at 5 in the morning to pray for you that one day you'd become a Christian." She said, "Even after you quit your paper out, I woke up at 5 in the morning to pray for you that you become a Christian." And she said, "Today, it's the day, like it's happened." And so she's weeping, I'm weeping. Like it's this really beautiful moment. And what was interesting to me was that I think what was so powerful for me as I heard that story was because I was not a nice kid growing up. I don't know that I was super well liked by older adults. And what was so cool was that on that day that I forgot her newspaper, Norma loved me in my most unlovable moment. She loved me so much. She loved me when I didn't deserve it. Like, she offered me grace when I didn't deserve the grace. She was Jesus to me when I didn't deserve it. And so Norma and George have both since passed away. But when I would go home to visit, I would visit three groups of people. I would visit my mom and dad, I would visit my grandparents, and I would visit George and Norma. I wouldn't visit the people who were my age. I wouldn't visit the people who I went to school with. I would visit George and Norma, because George and Norma showed me who Jesus was. And they cared about a young person who desperately needed Jesus, desperately needed Jesus. They cared about me when nobody else really cared about me. And I felt that love, and they never let that go. And my encouragement to each of you as leaders here at the church would, in your churches, would be that you love like Jesus, and it's embodied like George and Norma. To the young people who you don't understand, to the young people who are not kind to you, to the young people who don't seem to care, to the young people who are struggling, to the young people who are jerks, to the young people who you don't get along with, or you don't agree with, or you just simply don't understand, that you would love like Jesus loves, and that you would care about them endlessly, because that is the thing that actually made a difference in my life. And I believe that I've been in ministry for years today because of the things that I learned from George and Norma before I became a Christian and after I became a Christian. And so that's my encouragement to you. Keep plodding along, even though it feels a little bit like slog and you're walking through some muddy waters. You are doing great work. And so keep pushing along. So I think that's my time. I was exactly 30 minutes. I started at 8:03 my time, 2:03 your time. So anyway, Jake, I think that I'm passing this to you. And so why don't you take it from here, and I'll stick around for a couple minutes if I need to, okay?